Have you ever wondered what happens when someone's gift refuses to stay hidden, no matter how hard the world tries to bury it? What if the very thing they mocked became the thing they couldn't live without? Tonight, I'm going to share with you a story that most history books will never tell you. A story about a girl named Patience, born into bondage on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, who possessed something her captors could never understand, never control, and eventually, never resist. They laughed at her drawings, dismissed them as the foolish scribbles of a child who should have been working harder, sleeping less, dreaming never. But something strange began to happen on that plantation. Something that made the wealthiest visitors from Richmond and Charleston whisper among themselves. Something that made them return, again and again, with requests that bordered on desperation. If this story moves you the way it moved me when I first discovered it, hit that subscribe button right now, because we uncover stories like this every single week. Stories they tried to erase. Stories that refused to die. What happened to Patience and her drawings changed everything on that plantation, and by the end of this video you'll understand why they couldn't stop her, even when they tried to destroy everything she created. The truth is darker than you imagine, and more beautiful. Let's begin. The ruins of Harwood Plantation still stand along the banks of the James River in Virginia, though most people who drive past them don't know what they're seeing. The columns have crumbled into the kudzu vines that have spent a century and a half reclaiming what was never meant to be taken. The brick foundations have turned the color of dried blood, cracked and shifting with each passing season. If you walk through the overgrown pathways where imported roses once bloomed in mathematical precision, you might still find fragments of something unexpected buried in the Virginia clay. Small shards of charcoal, bits of oak bark with strange markings, scraps of paper so old they crumble at the touch, but before they do, you might catch a glimpse of faces, hands, trees, chains, fire. These are the last physical traces of what was created there between 1847 and 1859. These are the remains of Patience's drawings. But the real remains are not in the ground. They live in the descendants of those who survived Harwood, who still tell their children about the girl who drew the truth. They live in the 3 original drawings that somehow escaped destruction, now preserved in a private collection in Philadelphia, authenticated but never publicly displayed. They live in the letters exchanged between plantation wives throughout the South, letters that speak of the drawing girl, with a mixture of fascination and fear that bleeds through even the most carefully constructed sentences. What happened at Harwood was never supposed to become legend. It was supposed to be forgotten, erased, denied. The men who controlled that place spent considerable effort ensuring that certain records were burned, certain names were removed from ledgers, certain stories were never written down. But memory has its own architecture, its own resistance. And Patience had already taught everyone at Harwood something essential about what happens when you try to silence something that demands to be seen. The story of her drawings is not just a story about art, though art was its vehicle. It is not just a story about resistance, though resistance was its engine. It is a story about the most dangerous thing a human being can possess in a system built on blindness, the ability to make people see. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, cases that shake the foundations of what we think we know and reveal truths that were deliberately hidden, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single investigation. Harwood Plantation covered 1,200 acres of prime Virginia tobacco land in Albemarle County, purchased in 1802 by Cornelius Harwood the Elder from the estate of a British loyalist who had fled after the Revolution. By 1845, when this story properly begins, the plantation was under the control of his grandson, Thomas Elijah Harwood, a man whose reputation extended throughout the county and beyond, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of his tobacco. Thomas Harwood was 34 years old in 1845, recently returned from an extended tour of Europe, where he had acquired expensive tastes and a collection of French paintings that hung in the great house's parlor. He had also acquired, in his travels, a particular understanding of his own importance that expressed itself in every interaction with the people who served him. The European aristocrats he had dined with kept their servants at a distance, spoke of them rarely, thought of them less. Thomas Harwood, upon his return, adopted this philosophy with enthusiasm, referring to the enslaved people at Harwood as the inventory in his correspondence, and requiring that they never meet his eyes when speaking to him. The main house sat on a slight rise overlooking the river. 3 stories of red brick with white columns that could be seen from the Richmond Road. Behind it, at a distance precisely calculated to be visible from the parlor windows but not close enough to intrude on its atmosphere, stood the slave quarters. 14 cabins arranged in 2 rows, each cabin housing between 4 and 8 people depending on the season and the sales. Beyond the cabins lay the tobacco fields, 230 acres of them, where the soil had been worked by 4 generations of enslaved hands until it required increasingly elaborate interventions to produce anything at all. The work bell rang at 4 in the morning during planting and harvest seasons, half an hour before the sun showed itself over the tree line. The sound carried across the entire property, a thick iron clang that penetrated walls and sleep and dreams. Men, women, and children old enough to walk emerged from the cabins and made their way to the gathering point near the great barn, where the overseer, a man named Jeremiah Wicks, would already be waiting with his ledger and his whip and his particular talent for finding fault. Wickies had been at Harwood for 11 years by 1845. He was originally from the Carolina Low Country, where he had worked on a rice plantation before making his way north in search of better wages. He was not a large man, but he had learned early that size mattered less than conviction, and he possessed conviction in abundance. His whip was not decorative. The scars he created were famous throughout the county, so distinctive in their pattern that other overseers could identify his work on sight. He called this his signature and seemed genuinely proud of it. The hierarchy at Harwood descended from Thomas Harwood at the top through Wicks, and then through a series of enslaved drivers who were given marginal privileges in exchange for helping manage their own people. Below them came the field workers, ranked by productivity and age, and the various calculations that slavery demanded. At the very bottom, in theory, came the children who were too young to work the fields but old enough to be useful in smaller ways, carrying water, feeding chickens, running messages, staying out of the way. Patience belonged to this lowest category in 1845 when she was 7 years old. She had been born in the 3rd cabin on the left, the one closest to the small creek that ran behind the quarters before emptying into the James. Her mother, a woman named Ruth who worked in the tobacco shed sorting leaves, had given birth to 3 children before Patience. 2 had been sold south before they turned 10. 1 had died of fever at age 3. Ruth had learned by 1838, when Patience was born, to hold her love in a particular way, close enough to sustain, but not so close that losing it would destroy her entirely. Patience's father was unknown in the way that many fathers were unknown at Harwood. Ruth never spoke of him, and Patience learned early not to ask. This was one of many things she learned not to ask about. The questions that couldn't be answered were more numerous than the ones that could, and asking them only created pain without producing knowledge. What made Patience different was evident from the time she could hold a stick. While other children played the games that children play, chasing and hiding and inventing small worlds within their constrained reality, Patience drew. She drew in the dirt with her fingers. She drew on the cabin walls with charred wood from the fire. She drew on any surface that would accept a mark, and she drew constantly, compulsively, as if the images in her mind would cause her physical pain if she didn't release them. At first, her mother tried to stop her. Drawing was not useful. Drawing did not contribute to survival. Drawing, in fact, was dangerous because it attracted attention, and at Harwood, attention from the wrong people meant only one thing. Ruth scrubbed the drawings from the cabin walls. She forbade Patience from carrying charcoal. She threatened punishments that she never actually delivered because she could see, in her daughter's eyes, that this was not disobedience. This was something else. Something she didn't have a name for. By the time Patience was 6, her drawings had become so sophisticated that other enslaved people began to notice. She drew faces with such accuracy that anyone could identify who was depicted. She drew the tobacco plants in their various stages of growth. She drew the great house from multiple angles, capturing its proportions perfectly despite never having been taught anything about perspective or composition. She drew the James River at sunset, the color suggested somehow through her charcoal and dirt, the light implied through shadow. And she drew other things. Things that made the adults who saw them go very quiet. She drew Wicks with his whip raised. She drew Thomas Harwood on his horse looking down at rows of bent backs. She drew the auction block in Richmond where she had once accompanied her mother on a supply trip. She drew the expressions on faces that were about to be separated forever. She drew chains. She drew tears. She drew blood. These drawings were never displayed. They were hidden, shown only in whispers, destroyed when the risk became too great. But they existed. And their existence proved something that the entire system of Harwood was designed to deny, that the people held there saw everything, understood everything, remembered everything. Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. Ruth died in the winter of 1846 from a lung sickness that had been building for years from the dust in the tobacco sheds. She was 31 years old. The burial happened on a Tuesday afternoon, a brief gathering at the small cemetery beyond the quarters where generations of enslaved people had been laid to rest in unmarked graves. Patience, now 8, stood at the edge of the hole and watched the dirt fall on her mother's shrouded body and did not cry. She did not cry because something had gone still inside her. Not dead, but waiting, like a seed in winter ground. That night, alone in the cabin that she now shared with an elderly woman named Esther and 2 boys younger than herself, Patience took a piece of charcoal that she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard and began to draw. She drew her mother's face from memory, every detail perfect, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the particular way her lips curved when she was about to laugh, the depth of her eyes that held so much that was never spoken. She drew until her fingers cramped and the charcoal was ground to nothing. Then she rolled the drawing carefully and hid it in the same place the charcoal had been. She would keep it there for the next 13 years, checking on it periodically to ensure it had survived, until the night when everything changed. The system that governed Harwood had been designed over generations to extract maximum labor while maintaining minimum cost. Every person there existed as an entry in a ledger, their value calculated in dollars, their time allocated in hours, their potential measured against their price. But within this system, there were gradations of suffering that the ledger could never capture. The field workers had it worst in terms of physical labor. 12 to 16 hours during the busy seasons, bending and cutting and hauling under the Virginia sun, supervised by Wicks with his whip and his signature. The house servants had easier physical labor, but harder psychological burdens, living in proximity to the Harwood family, expected to anticipate needs, smile through humiliations, become invisible on command. Then there were the specialists. The blacksmith who kept the tools in working order, the carpenter who maintained the buildings, the cook who fed not only the Harwood family, but organized the provisions for everyone on the property. These people had skills that gave them a different kind of value, a value that sometimes translated into marginally better treatment, occasionally into the ability to negotiate, rarely into anything resembling security. Patience's mother had been a sorter, a position that required experience but not strength, which was why she had been able to do it even as her lungs failed her. After Ruth died, the question arose of what to do with her daughter. Patience was small for her age, not suited for field work. She had no training in any of the specialized skills. She was, according to the ledger, worth very little. It was the cook, a woman named Hester, who had been at Harwood for 40 years, who intervened. Hester had seen Patience's drawings. More importantly, Hester understood something about the great house that few others did. That Mrs. Harwood, Thomas's wife Caroline, was perpetually bored and perpetually seeking novelty to fill her days. "The child draws," Hester told Caroline Harwood during one of their weekly meetings to discuss household supplies. "Draws like nothing I've ever seen. Might be something you'd want to see for yourself, ma'am." Caroline Harwood was 29 years old in 1846, 5 years married, mother of 2 children, who were primarily raised by enslaved women, while she occupied herself with correspondence, embroidery, and the exhausting work of maintaining her social position. She had been educated in Richmond, taught the accomplishments expected of a woman of her class, music, French, and a little drawing, just enough to sketch flowers in a journal, nothing more. The suggestion that an enslaved child might have talent in this area struck her as absurd, possibly offensive. But she was bored, and curiosity, even skeptical curiosity, was better than nothing. "Bring her to me tomorrow," Caroline said. "We'll see what this is about." The next afternoon, Patience stood in the parlor of the great house for the first time in her life. The room was overwhelming. The French paintings, the crystal chandelier, the wallpaper imported from England, the carpet so thick her bare feet sank into it. Caroline Harwood sat in a chair by the window, backlit by autumn sunlight, her face difficult to read. "You're the one who draws," Caroline said. It was not a question. Patience nodded, keeping her eyes down as she had been taught. "Look at me when I speak to you." Patience raised her eyes. Caroline Harwood's face came into focus. Thin lips, pale eyes, the beginning of lines around her mouth that spoke of frequent displeasure. But there was something else there too, something that might have been curiosity, or might have been something colder. "They say you can draw anything, is that true?" "I don't know, ma'am." "Don't know if you can draw or don't know if it's anything?" "I just draw what I see." Caroline gestured to a small table near the fireplace where paper and pencils had been arranged. "Show me. Draw something. Anything." Patience walked to the table. The paper was the finest she had ever touched, smooth and white and perfect. The pencils were sharpened to precise points, their wood painted in colors she had never seen on any tool. She picked one up and felt its weight, its potential. "What should I draw, ma'am?" I said anything. "Surprise me." Patience looked around the room. The paintings on the walls showed European scenes, landscapes and portraits of people who had probably never existed. The furniture was dark wood, carved into shapes that suggested leaves and vines and flowers. The windows framed a view of the grounds, the slave quarters visible in the distance, smoke rising from their chimneys. She began to draw. Caroline watched, expecting the clumsy marks of a child playing at art. What she saw instead made her go very still. Patience drew Caroline Harwood herself, not as she appeared in the flattering portrait that hung in the upstairs hallway, but as she actually looked in that moment. The thin lips slightly parted, the pale eyes with their complicated light, the lines around her mouth, the way her hands gripped the arms of the chair with more tension than her casual posture suggested, the expensive dress with its perfect stitching, the pearls at her throat, the curl of hair that had escaped its pins and lay against her neck. It took less than 10 minutes. When Patience stepped back, Caroline rose from her chair and crossed the room to look. For a long moment, she said nothing. "How did you learn this?" she finally asked. "I didn't learn it, ma'am. I just see things, and then I draw them." Caroline picked up the drawing and held it closer to the light. The likeness was unmistakable, almost uncanny, but it was more than likeness. There was something in the drawing that felt like truth, the kind of truth that mirrors couldn't capture, that paintings commissioned from professional artists carefully avoided. "You've never had a lesson? Never been taught?" "No, ma'am." Caroline set the drawing down. Her face had changed in some subtle way, the skepticism replaced by something more difficult to name. "You'll come to the house every afternoon," she said. "I'll have materials brought for you. You'll draw what I tell you to draw. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. And you'll speak of this to no one unless I give permission. No one in the quarters, no one in the house. This is between us." "Yes, ma'am." Caroline nodded, then seemed to remember something. "What's your name?" "Patience, ma'am." "Patience." Caroline repeated the word as if testing its weight. "How appropriate. You may go now. Return tomorrow at this same time." Patience left the great house with her head full of questions she knew better than to ask. Behind her, Caroline Harwood stood at the window watching the small figure cross the yard toward the quarters, the drawing still in her hand, studying it as if it might reveal secrets beyond its surface. That night, Caroline showed the drawing to her husband. Thomas Harwood examined it with the casual interest he gave to most things his wife presented, expecting to find something charming and childish that he could praise briefly before returning to his newspaper. What he saw made him set down his whiskey. This was drawn by a child? By one of ours. A girl, 8 or 9 years old. She's never had a moment's instruction. Thomas looked at the drawing again. The technical skill was undeniable, but what truly struck him was the perception behind it. This was not flattery. This was observation, precise and unflinching. He wasn't sure he liked being observed this precisely by anyone, let alone by a piece of his property. "What do you intend to do with her?" "I haven't decided yet," Caroline said. "But I thought you should know she exists." Thomas handed the drawing back. "Keep me informed of any developments." He returned to his newspaper, but his mind kept circling back to the image of his wife captured by an enslaved child's hand. There was power in that kind of seeing, power that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. In the months that followed, Patience's daily sessions in the great house became routine. Caroline provided her with materials that would have been unimaginable before: real paper, quality pencils, eventually charcoal sticks made for artists rather than fragments scraped from cooking fires. Patience drew whatever Caroline requested: views of the house and grounds, the children playing in the garden, flowers from the greenhouse, the family dogs posed on the porch. These drawings accumulated in a portfolio that Caroline kept in her private sitting room. She showed them to no one, guarding them with a possessiveness that surprised even herself. She told herself it was because she was cultivating a talent, developing a resource that might prove useful someday. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that seeing the world through Patience's eyes had become something she craved, something that broke up the monotony of her days in ways that nothing else could. Patience, for her part, learned to navigate this strange new territory. She learned which subjects pleased her mistress and which made her uncomfortable. She learned to soften certain truths while sharpening others. She learned that Caroline wanted to be seen, but only in certain lights, from certain angles. And she learned to hide her other drawings, the ones she made at night in the cabin, the ones that told different stories entirely. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, a private transaction between them, if not for the events of Christmas 1848. The Harwoods' Christmas celebrations were famous throughout the county. Guests arrived from Richmond and Charlottesville, from neighboring plantations and distant connections, to spend a week in comfort and festivity at Harwood. There were balls and dinners, hunting parties for the men, endless rounds of visits for the women. The enslaved population worked around the clock to make it all possible, sleeping in shifts, appearing and disappearing like ghosts to ensure that no guest ever wanted for anything. That year, Caroline decided to do something different. During a luncheon for the ladies while the men were out shooting quail, she announced that she had a special entertainment prepared. "I've been keeping a secret," she said, enjoying the attention that confession immediately drew. "Something quite remarkable that I've discovered here at Harwood. A natural talent unlike anything I've ever encountered." The ladies leaned forward, intrigued. Caroline gestured to a servant, who left and returned moments later with Patience, scrubbed clean and dressed in a simple but neat dress that had been made for the occasion. "This is Patience," Caroline said. "She's going to draw your portraits." The reaction was mixed. Some of the ladies laughed, assuming it was a joke. Others looked offended at the suggestion that an enslaved child could capture their likenesses. A few seemed genuinely curious. "I assure you," Caroline continued, "you'll want to see this. Mrs. Whitfield, would you be so kind as to go first?" Clarissa Whitfield, wife of a Richmond banker, was the highest-ranking guest present. She couldn't refuse without seeming ungracious, so she arranged herself in a chair with exaggerated patience, clearly expecting to be disappointed. Patience stood before her with her drawing materials and began to work. The room went quiet as the ladies watched. Even those who had been most skeptical found themselves captivated by the confidence of the child's movements, the certainty with which she marked the paper. When she finished and handed the drawing to Mrs. Whitfield, the silence deepened. Clarissa Whitfield stared at her own image for a very long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "It's me," she said softly. "It's actually me." The drawing made its way around the room. Each woman who saw it went quiet in the same way, recognizing something in the precision of Patience's lines that went beyond mere accuracy. One by one, they requested their own portraits. Patience worked for 3 hours straight, producing drawing after drawing, each one provoking the same reaction: surprise, recognition, something that might have been wonder. By the end of the afternoon, the ladies were no longer laughing. They were competing for Patience's attention, offering suggestions about poses and expressions, asking questions about her process that she mostly couldn't answer because she didn't understand her own gift any more than they did. That evening at dinner, the women told their husbands about what they had witnessed. The men were skeptical until the drawings were produced, passed around the table, examined by firelight. Thomas Harwood watched his guest react to his property's talent with a mixture of pride and unease. This was attention, and attention was valuable. But it was also unpredictable. "You must bring her out again tomorrow," insisted Judge Crawford, a powerful man from Richmond whose opinion carried weight. "I want to see this for myself." The next day, Patience drew the men: Judge Crawford, Mr. Whitfield the banker, Colonel Morrison, who had fought in the Mexican War, Thomas Harwood himself, though he insisted on seeing the result before anyone else and quietly destroyed the first version because he didn't like what it revealed about his expression. By the end of the holiday, Patience's drawings were all anyone could talk about. The guests departed with promises to return, with requests for commissions, with stories to tell that would spread throughout Virginia and beyond. Caroline Harwood had gambled and won. Her discovery was now famous. But fame at Harwood was never simple. The invitations began arriving in January. Would the Harwoods bring their remarkable drawing girl to Richmond for a special engagement? Would they consider lending her services for a particular event? Would they perhaps accept this sum for a commission to be completed by this date? Thomas Harwood recognized opportunity when he saw it. He began to hire Patience out for portrait sessions, charging fees that wealthy Virginians were apparently willing to pay for the novelty of having their likenesses captured by an enslaved child with an inexplicable gift. The money was good, much better than anything Patience could have generated through agricultural labor. And there were other benefits: social capital, connections, the pleasure of owning something that everyone else wanted. For Patience, now 10 years old, life changed in ways both better and worse. Better because she was no longer subject to the arbitrary cruelties of field work. Better because she spent her days doing the things she needed to do as much as breathing. Better because she was allowed materials, given time, treated as something valuable rather than something disposable. But worse because she was now watched constantly, her movements controlled, her interactions monitored. Worse because she had to produce on demand, draw what she was told to draw, capture likenesses that pleased clients who had very specific ideas about how they should look. Worse because she was taken from Harwood to unfamiliar places where she knew no one, where she was displayed like an exotic animal, where people touched her hair and examined her hands and asked each other how such a creature could possibly create such work. And worse, most of all, because she understood now what her gift meant to the people who owned her. It meant money. It meant status. It meant she would never be sold south like her siblings, but also that she would never be forgotten, never be overlooked, never be allowed to disappear into the anonymous mass of labor that might at least offer the protection of invisibility. She was valuable, and at Harwood, being valuable meant being watched. In the quarters, Patience's new position created complications. Some saw her as fortunate, blessed with an escape from the worst of plantation life. Others saw her as a traitor, a collaborator who had traded her loyalty for comfort. The truth was somewhere in between, as truth usually is, but truth mattered less than perception, and perception was dangerous. Old Esther, the woman Patience shared her cabin with, tried to help her navigate these waters. "You got a gift," Esther said, "and that gift got you attention, and attention can save you or destroy you depending on how you carry it. You got to learn to be two people now, the one they see and the one you really are. Never let them become the same." Patience understood. She had always understood that she was two people, had been two people since the moment she first realized that the drawings in her mind could not all be shown, that some images had to stay hidden if she wanted to survive. The public Patience drew portraits that flattered, that pleased, that earned money for her owners. The private Patience still drew at night, by firelight when no one was watching, images that told different stories. She drew the faces of people in the quarters, their dignity and their pain, their humanity that the system was designed to deny. She drew the work, the endless backbreaking labor that produced the wealth that paid for French paintings and English wallpaper and elaborate Christmas celebrations. She drew the violence, the whippings she had witnessed, the blood that stained the ground near the great barn where Wickes delivered his signature. She drew the separations, Families torn apart at the auction block, mothers reaching for children they would never see again. These drawings were hidden carefully, shown only to a few trusted people, destroyed when the risk of discovery grew too great. They were not valuable in any way that Thomas Harwood would recognize. They could not be sold or displayed or used to impress dinner guests. They were simply true, and truth at Harwood was the most dangerous thing anyone could possess. The years passed. Patience grew from a child into a young woman, her talent deepening, her reputation spreading. By 1855, when she was 17, she had been hired out to households throughout Virginia and into the neighboring states. She had drawn governors and senators, plantation owners and their wives, children posed with toys they would outgrow, and slaves they would inherit. She had become known as the Harwood Girl, a curiosity, a wonder, a testament to the strange possibilities of an institution that most defenders claimed was ordained by God. She had also become necessary to the Harwood finances in ways that Thomas Harwood preferred not to examine too closely. The tobacco crops had been disappointing for several years. The soil was exhausted, the prices depressed, the costs of maintaining such a large operation increasingly burdensome. The money that Patience brought in, through commissions and exhibition fees, had become a significant portion of the household income. She was no longer a novelty, she was an investment, and investments had to be protected. This meant that Patience was treated better than most enslaved people at Harwood, but it also meant that she was watched more carefully. Thomas Harwood had developed a paranoid fear that someone would try to buy her from him, or worse, that she might attempt to escape. He had heard stories of talented enslaved people who had been helped to freedom by abolitionist networks, their skills making them valuable enough to justify the risk. Patience would not become one of those stories, not while she belonged to him. The summer of 1855 brought visitors from Charleston, a family named Broussard, who had made their fortune in rice and were looking to invest in Virginia land. They arrived at Harwood with an entourage that included their 3 children, their personal servants, and an air of superiority that irritated even Caroline Harwood, who was not easily irritated by people with money. Jean-Pierre Broussard was a man of 50, French-descended, educated in Paris, possessed of opinions on every subject that he shared freely and at length. His wife, Margaret, was much younger, a Charleston beauty who had married for position and received it, though at the cost of living with a husband she clearly didn't like. Their children were spoiled in the specific way that only children of extreme privilege can be spoiled, unable to imagine that the world might not arrange itself for their convenience. They stayed for 2 weeks. During that time, they demanded constant entertainment, which meant constant work for the enslaved people at Harwood. The field workers were driven harder so that their labor could fund the elaborate dinners. The house servants ran themselves ragged, catering to every whim, and Patience was summoned repeatedly to draw portraits, landscapes, anything that might impress the guests. It was during one of these sessions that the incident occurred. Charles Broussard, the eldest son, was 15 years old and already exhibited the cruelty that his father had spent a lifetime perfecting. He had been watching Patience draw his younger sister when he decided that the process was taking too long. "Make her smile more," he commanded. "She looks like a ghost in your picture." Patience continued drawing. "I draw what I see, sir." "Then see her smiling more. Are you deaf as well as black?" Patience set down her pencil. "I can draw what's there. I can't draw what isn't." Charles Broussard was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially by an enslaved person. His face flushed red. Before anyone could intervene, he crossed the room and slapped Patience across the face hard enough to knock her from her chair. The room went silent. Caroline Harwood rose from her seat, her expression unreadable. Thomas Harwood, who had been discussing business with Jean-Pierre Broussard in the corner, turned to see what had happened. "She was insolent," Charles said, his voice cracking slightly. "She needed correction." Thomas Harwood looked at Patience on the floor, at the blood beginning to show at the corner of her lip, at the drawing that had fallen beside her. He calculated quickly. The Broussards were potential investors. Their goodwill was worth money. But Patience was also worth money, and damage to her was damage to his property. "Caroline," he said finally, "perhaps we should take a break from the portrait session. I'm sure Patience needs a moment to collect herself. It was not an apology. It was not even an acknowledgement that wrong had been done. But it was an ending, a change of subject, a diplomatic solution to an awkward situation. Patience picked herself up from the floor. She gathered her materials. She left the room without looking at anyone, without saying anything, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. That night, in the cabin, she drew Charles Broussard. But not the way she would have drawn him for a commission. Not the way his mother would have wanted him captured for posterity. She drew him as he truly was. The cruelty in his eyes, the weakness in his chin, the petulance of his mouth. She drew him hitting her, his hand raised, her head snapping back. She drew the truth. Then she burned the drawing, watching the paper curl and blacken and dissolve into ash. It was too dangerous to keep, but she had made it, and that mattered. She had seen him, truly seen him, and put what she saw onto paper, even if only for a moment. She had refused to be blind. The Broussards left Harwood a few days later, having decided that Virginia land was not to their taste after all. Thomas Harwood blamed the failed deal on the incident with Patience, though he never said so directly. Caroline Harwood, for her part, became slightly more protective of her drawing girl, recognizing perhaps that the talent was fragile, that the person who possessed it could be damaged in ways that would affect the talent itself. But the damage had already been done, not to Patience's ability to draw, but to something deeper. She had always known what she was at Harwood. She had never been under any illusions. But the slap, the casual violence of it, the fact that it had been witnessed by powerful people who did nothing, had crystallized something inside her. A resolution, a cold clarity that would shape everything that followed. She began to plan. The Underground Railroad had operatives throughout Virginia, networks of free black people, sympathetic whites, and escaped slaves who had stayed in the region to help others find their way north. Patience had heard whispers about these networks for years, fragmented information that passed through the quarters despite all efforts to suppress it. She had always dismissed the possibility of escape as too dangerous, too uncertain, too likely to end in disaster. But after the summer of 1855, she began to listen more carefully. The problem was access. She was watched too closely, her movements tracked, her value to Thomas Harwood too great for him to risk losing her. Unlike the field workers who might be overlooked during the chaos of harvest season, Patience was always accounted for. An escape attempt would be noticed immediately. The pursuit would be relentless. She needed a different strategy. What she had, she realized, was information. Her drawings had taken her into homes throughout the region, had shown her the layouts of properties, the habits of families, the vulnerabilities of systems. She had observed things that no one expected her to observe because no one expected an enslaved girl to be truly watching. But she had been watching. She had been watching her entire life. She began to draw maps. Not on paper that could be discovered, but in her mind at first, detailed mental images of routes and roads and landmarks. Then, carefully, on scraps that she could hide and destroy, she began to create visual records of what she had learned. The location of safe houses that she had deduced from overheard conversations, the patterns of patrol that she had observed on her travels, the geography of the region that she had studied during carriage rides to her commissions. She shared this information with a woman named Lila, a laundress at Harwood who had connections to the railroad. Lila couldn't read or write, but she could remember pictures, could describe what Patience showed her to people who could use the information. The drawings became a kind of currency, exchanged in whispers, passed from hand to hand, guiding people to freedom. It was slow work and dangerous. Every drawing was a risk. Every conversation was a gamble. But Patience was patient. She had been named for patience, and she had learned to embody it. She would wait as long as necessary. In the meantime, she continued to draw for the Harwoods and their clients. She smiled when she was expected to smile. She produced portraits that flattered and pleased. She became so good at being two people that she sometimes wondered which one was real. The winter of 1857 brought the first tangible success of her efforts. A family of 5 from a neighboring plantation used a route she had mapped to reach Pennsylvania. Word filtered back through the network. They had made it. All of them. the children, and the parents, and the grandmother who could barely walk. They were free. Patience received this news while sitting in the Harwoods' parlor, drawing Mrs. Harwood's newest dress for a fashion magazine in Richmond. She kept her face perfectly still, gave no sign of what she had heard, completed the commission with her usual precision. That night, alone in her cabin, she allowed herself a few moments of something that might have been joy. More successes followed. Not many, because the risks were too great to help too many, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to prove that her gift could be used for something beyond the enrichment of people who owned her. But even as Patience carved out this small territory of resistance, the world around her was changing in ways that would eventually engulf everything she had built. The late 1850s were years of increasing tension throughout the South. The conflict over slavery had moved from a simmer to something closer to a boil. Events like the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the violent battles in Kansas had convinced many that war was inevitable. At Harwood, Thomas Harwood read the newspapers with growing alarm, calculating what conflict would mean for his investments, his property, his way of life. His response was to tighten control. Security at Harwood increased. The enslaved population was watched more carefully than ever. News from the outside world was suppressed as much as possible, and Patience, whose travels had made her a potential liability, found her commissions restricted to nearby properties where Thomas Harwood had allies who would report any suspicious behavior. The network that Patience had helped build went quiet. It was too dangerous now to move information, to help people escape. Everyone waited, knowing that something was coming, but not knowing when or how it would arrive. The year 1859 brought two events that changed everything. The first was personal. In March, a man named Solomon arrived at Harwood from a plantation in the eastern part of the state. He was 25 years old, skilled in carpentry, purchased to help with repairs on buildings that had been neglected during the lean financial years. He was also, as Patience would discover, connected to networks that went further and deeper than anything she had previously encountered. They met in the quarters, an unremarkable introduction between two people whose paths had no obvious reason to cross. But Solomon had been told about the drawing girl, about the map she had made, about the role she had played in recent escapes. He sought her out deliberately, carefully, using the slow and cautious methods that survival in their world demanded. Their relationship developed over months, a gradual trust built through shared purpose and shared risk. Solomon told her about plans that were larger than anything she had imagined, about coordinated efforts that linked enslaved people throughout the region, about the possibility of something more than individual escapes. Patience told him about what she had learned, what she had seen, what she could still contribute. She also, eventually, told him other things. About her mother, about the siblings she had lost, about the drawings hidden beneath the floorboard that no one else had ever seen. Solomon listened the way no one had ever listened to her before, with a stillness and attention that made her feel visible in a way her drawings had never achieved. They became more than allies. They became essential to each other, each providing what the other lacked. Solomon's connections to the wider network, Patience's detailed knowledge of regional geography, and the homes of the powerful. Together, they began to plan something that went beyond helping individuals escape. They began to plan documentation. The idea came to Patience during one of her increasingly rare portrait commissions. She was drawing the wife of a man who served in the Virginia state legislature, a woman who spoke freely in front of an enslaved artist she considered incapable of understanding complex ideas. The woman mentioned a debate about the future of slavery, about arguments that abolitionists had made using stories and testimonies from formerly enslaved people. "It's all lies, of course," the woman said. "Fabrications designed to inflame Northern sentiment. No one who truly knew our peculiar institution would describe it the way they do." Patience continued drawing, her face revealing nothing. But her mind was racing. What if there were records? What if there were images, created by someone who had truly known the institution, that could not be dismissed as fabrications? What if there were drawings so detailed, so precise, so obviously authentic that they could serve as evidence? She began to create these drawings in secret, using materials she had hidden away over the years. Not maps this time, but documentation. Scenes of plantation life that showed the truth that public portraits would never capture. The labor, the punishments, the dehumanization. The faces of people who would otherwise be forgotten, their dignity preserved in charcoal and paper when everything else had been stripped away. Solomon helped her hide the drawings, smuggled some of them north through the network's channels, ensured that they reached people who could preserve them and eventually use them. The work was slow, painstaking, dangerous, beyond anything Patience had previously undertaken, but it felt important in a way that her portrait work never had. It felt like purpose. The second event of 1859 was public, and it changed everything. In October, John Brown and his followers attacked the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising that would spread throughout the South. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged in December. But the reaction to his action created shockwaves that reached every plantation in Virginia, including Harwood. Thomas Harwood responded to Harper's Ferry with something approaching panic. He saw abolitionists everywhere now, threats in every shadow, the possibility of violence from his own enslaved population that he had never seriously considered before. Security tightened further. Punishments for minor infractions became severe. The atmosphere at Harwood shifted from oppression to terror. Solomon was among the first to feel this shift. In November, accused of speaking to another enslaved man about the Harper's Ferry raid, he was subjected to one of Wicks's worst punishments. Patience heard his screams from the cabin where she had been confined. She was not allowed to see him until 3 days later, when he could finally stand again. "They're going to sell me," he told her. His voice was calm, but his eyes showed the truth. "There's a buyer coming from Georgia next week. Thomas Harwood has decided I'm too dangerous to keep. We'll leave," Patience said. "Both of us. We'll use the routes I mapped. We can make it. You can't leave. They watch you too closely. And if you disappear now, they'll destroy everything you've built. The documentation, the networks, all of it. None of that matters. It's all that matters." Solomon took her hands. "Listen to me. What you've created, what you can still create, it's bigger than either of us. You're going to stay here and finish what we started. And I'm going to Georgia, and maybe someday when this is all over, we'll find each other again. This will never be over. It will be over." His certainty was absolute. Not today, not next year, maybe not in our lifetimes, but it will end. And when it does, they're going to need evidence. They're going to need records. They're going to need the truth, drawn by someone who was there. Solomon was sold the following week. Patience watched from a distance as he was loaded into a wagon bound for the auction house in Richmond. He didn't look back. He had told her not to watch, knowing she would anyway. It was his final gift to her, the knowledge that he knew her completely. After he was gone, Patience did what she had always done. She drew. She drew Solomon's face from memory, every detail perfect. She drew the wagon that took him away. She drew the expression on Thomas Harwood's face as he counted the money the sale had brought him. She drew Wicks's whip with its distinctive marks. She drew everything she had ever seen and hidden and remembered. Then she hid the drawings and returned to her public work, producing portraits that flattered entertaining guests with her remarkable talent, playing the role that had always been required of her. No one who watched her during those months would have suspected that anything had changed. She was the same drawing girl she had always been, but something had changed. The cold clarity that had crystallized inside her after the Broussard incident had deepened into something harder, something unbreakable. She no longer drew to please or to earn, or even to survive. She drew to remember. She drew to testify. She drew so that someday, when the world was ready to see the truth, the evidence would exist. The war came in 1861, faster than anyone had expected, and slower than anyone had feared. Virginia seceded from the Union in April. Thomas Harwood, who had always considered himself a moderate on sectional issues, threw his support behind the Confederacy with the fervor of a convert. Young white men from the surrounding counties enlisted and marched away to the sound of bands and the waving of flags. At Harwood, life continued much as it always had. except that now the oppression was patriotic. The early years of the war brought little change to the plantation. The tobacco still needed to be grown, processed, sold. The enslaved population still needed to be fed and controlled and worked. The great house still needed to be maintained. Patience still drew portraits, though less frequently now that the war had disrupted the social circuits that had generated her commissions. But the war was coming closer. Everyone could feel it. The sounds of distant cannon fire became part of the landscape. News of battles fought and lost filtered through despite efforts to suppress it. The networks that had gone quiet after Harper's Ferry began to stir again, sensing opportunity in the chaos. In 1862, Union forces began moving through Virginia. The Peninsula Campaign brought federal troops closer to Harwood than they had ever been. Thomas Harwood buried his valuables and made plans to evacuate if necessary. The enslaved people watched and waited, understanding that something was shifting, that the ground beneath the institution that held them was beginning to crack. The Emancipation Proclamation came in January 1863. It didn't free anyone at Harwood, which was still firmly in Confederate territory, but it changed the meaning of the war. This was now explicitly a war about slavery, about whether people like Patience would remain property or become something else. The knowledge of this change filtered into the quarters, despite every effort to contain it. Patience continued her documentation. By now she had created hundreds of drawings, a comprehensive visual record of life at Harwood and the surrounding plantations. She had hidden them in locations throughout the property, not trusting any single hiding place to survive what was coming. She had also begun teaching others what she knew, sharing techniques with young people in the quarters who showed aptitude, ensuring that even if something happened to her, the work could continue. The spring of 1864 brought the war directly to Harwood's doorstep. Grant's overland campaign pushed Confederate forces back through Virginia, leaving devastation in its wake. The Union Army passed within miles of the plantation, close enough that their fires were visible at night. Thomas Harwood fled to Richmond with his family, leaving Wicks in charge of the property and its human inventory. Wicks, freed from his master's moderating presence, became worse than ever. He interpreted the chaos of war as an opportunity to exercise power without constraint. Punishments became more brutal, rations were cut. The fear that had always saturated life at Harwood intensified to the point of unbearability. It was during this period that Patience's drawings finally became dangerous in a way they had never been before. A young man named James, one of the field workers, had been planning an escape with his family. He knew about the routes that Patience had mapped years ago, had studied them through intermediaries, had prepared for months. When Wicks discovered the plan through an informant, he came looking for evidence of who had helped them. The search led to Patience's cabin. Wicks found one of her hiding places, a loose board beneath her sleeping pallet. Under it was a drawing of the auction block in Richmond, detailed and damning, clearly created from personal observation. There were other drawings as well. Wicks himself with his whip raised, Thomas Harwood counting money, scenes of violence and dehumanization that no one was supposed to see. "What is this?" Wicks demanded, though the question was rhetorical. He knew exactly what it was. Evidence, testimony, truth. Patience said nothing. There was nothing to say. Wicks beat her badly enough that she couldn't walk for a week. He burned the drawings he had found, watching them turn to ash with an expression of satisfaction. He announced to the entire enslaved population that anyone caught helping the drawing girl with her lies would receive the same treatment, or worse. But he didn't kill her. Thomas Harwood had given specific instructions before he left. Patience was valuable property, and property was not to be destroyed without permission. Even Wicks, in his brutality, understood that there were limits to what he could do without consequences. Patience recovered, slowly. The drawings he had burned were not her only copies. She had been careful, had distributed duplicates, had hidden originals in places that not even Wicks's thorough search had discovered. She had lost some of her work, but not all of it, not nearly all of it. And now she understood something important. The war was ending. The Confederacy was crumbling. Whatever came next, there would be a need for records, for evidence, for truth. Everything she had created, everything she had suffered to preserve, was about to become more valuable than it had ever been. The end came In April 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The news reached Harwood a few days later, carried by Union soldiers who arrived to occupy the property. Thomas Harwood never returned. He had died of typhoid in Richmond during the final weeks of the war. Wickies fled before the soldiers arrived, disappearing into the chaos of the defeated South, never to be seen at Harwood again. Patience was 27 years old when freedom came. She had spent her entire life as property, had seen things that no one should have to see, had survived in ways that survival shouldn't require. And she had documented it all. In the months that followed, she gathered her drawings from their various hiding places. There were hundreds of them, a comprehensive visual record of slavery at Harwood and beyond. She organized them, preserved them as well as she could with the limited materials available, began the long process of deciding what to do with them. Some of the drawings eventually made their way to abolitionists in the North, who used them as evidence in the ongoing debate about what slavery had truly been. Others were published in newspapers and magazines, accompanying articles about the horrors of the institution. A few became famous, reproduced in books and pamphlets that circulated throughout the country. But most of them stayed with Patience, unpublished, unseen, known only to her and to the people she had trusted with fragments of her work over the years. These were the most personal drawings, the ones that couldn't be reduced to political arguments or moral lessons. The face of her mother, preserved in charcoal. The image of Solomon as she had last seen him. The countless portraits of people who had lived and worked and suffered and died at Harwood. Their names remembered only by her. She never stopped drawing. In the years after the war, she became known as an artist, sought out by historians and journalists who wanted images of the enslaved South. She produced some of these commissions, but she was selective, no longer willing to draw simply because someone was willing to pay. She chose her subjects carefully, ensuring that every image she created served the truth she had committed herself to preserving. She never saw Solomon again. She learned through patient inquiry that he had died in Georgia in 1863, one of countless enslaved people who didn't live to see freedom. She drew him from memory, over and over, in different poses and different lights, keeping him alive in the only way she could. The plantation guests who had once mocked her drawings and then begged to see more were gone now, scattered by war and defeat and the collapse of the world they had built. Some of them survived. Most didn't matter anymore. What mattered were the people who had helped her, the networks that had carried her information north, the faces she had preserved when everything else about them had been erased. Patience died in 1892, at the age of 54, in a small house in Philadelphia, where she had lived for nearly 20 years. She left behind thousands of drawings, most of them never seen by the public, many of them still undiscovered. Her obituary in the local newspaper mentioned her briefly as an artist of some reputation, but it didn't begin to capture what she had actually accomplished. The 3 drawings that survive in that private collection in Philadelphia are from her early period, portraits of plantation guests that somehow escaped the various destructions that followed. They show her remarkable technical skill, her ability to capture not just likeness but essence, the gift that had made her famous and valuable and watched. But they don't show her real work. Her real work was documentation, testimony, truth-telling. Her real work was using her gift not to flatter the powerful, but to record what they had done. Her real work was ensuring that when the world was finally ready to see, the evidence would exist. They mocked her drawings because they didn't understand what she was actually doing. They begged to see more because they couldn't resist the truth, even when it made them uncomfortable. And she gave them what they asked for, portrait after portrait, image after image, all while creating something else entirely in the shadows. The legend of Patience lived on in the communities that remembered her. In the years after her death, stories circulated about the drawing girl who had mapped escape routes with her pictures, who had documented the horrors of slavery while pretending to create pretty portraits, who had refused to be silenced even when silence seemed like the only way to survive. Some of these stories were exaggerated, as stories tend to be. Some were probably invented. But at their core, they contained the same essential truth, that Patience had used her gift as a weapon, that she had turned her extraordinary ability to see into an act of resistance, that she had refused to let the truth be buried. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Patience's story touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of Patience is never forgotten. The ruins of Harwood still stand along the James River, crumbling into the Virginia earth, reclaimed by the land that never really belonged to the people who claimed it. If you walk through those ruins today, you might find fragments of charcoal in the clay, remnants of a fire that burned a very long time ago. Those fragments are the last physical traces of what was created there. But Patience's true legacy lives elsewhere. It lives in the drawings that survived, in the stories that persisted, in the truth that refused to be silenced. She was mocked. She was enslaved. She was beaten and sold and treated as property for 27 years. But she saw everything. And she made sure that what she saw would never be forgotten.